All right, folks. Next video. Here we go. I think what we're going to do here is we're going to do a short series. So over the next couple of videos that are going to come, I'm not quite sure how many it's going to take. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you every single type of buttonhole that I know how to make that applies to 18th century making. There's a number of different types of buttonholes. Some of them function, some of them purely decorative. Some of them are more akin to embroidery than they are anything sort of actually functional. Some of them are nothing more than pinching the thread to get, or pinching the fabric together to make a raised section to give the appearance of a buttonhole. Some of these are almost always used in Anglo-American tailoring. Some of these are almost never used in Anglo-American tailoring, and you only ever see them in continental stuff, be that the German regions, Sweden, Switzerland, France. Some of those will be rather interesting to see when we get to those, because most of us, I think, do Anglo-American work, and we just don't see these very often. Which unfortunately means I don't get an opportunity to do them very often. So it will be fun to do those. So that's what we're going to do. Over the next series of videos, we're going to cover various buttonholes. So today what we're going to start with is just your average, common, working class, functional buttonhole. Nothing special, nothing fancy, but not ugly. So one thing that you will notice if you pay attention to buttonhole work, in particular on Anglo-American stuff, buttonholes seem to be almost always used on Anglo-American stuff. Buttonholes in particular made with the buttonhole stitch, which we're about to go over here. Even the false ones are almost universally made with the buttonhole stitch, and almost universally made with 2 rows of stitching, that being a row of stitching going up and a row of stitching coming back. That is not true of a number of things that we see on the continent. They always seem to be of what I would consider pretty good quality. Buttonholes just seem to be ingrained in the culture of making in Anglo-American stuff, and they just aren't really ever done poorly. They're done better than they are at other times, but they're never really done poorly, which again cannot always be said of some of the stuff we see coming from the continent. Couldn't tell you why that is. It just is. Some of the other people who are way more focused on the actual history of all of this stuff, like the Williamsburg guys, may have a better idea as to why that is. They dig a lot more into the actual history of this stuff. I really tend to just focus more on just making things. So I quite often find myself turning to them as well to answer questions about, what terminologies mean and why things maybe exist the way they do. I frankly just don't have the time to dig into that stuff the way that they do, unfortunately. So we're going to go ahead and dive into this here. So just your normal working class buttonhole. These aren't terribly different whenever they're done on higher end stuff. It's just really the materials that are used are better, and the workmanship might be a little bit better. But even when you see a pair of breeches that would belong to the officer class or the gentleman class, or same thing on a waistcoat, where they're not necessarily making long decorative buttonholes, they're just kind of making functional ones. They're done in the same way we're gonna show here, just with nicer stuff, and then they end up with a nicer outcome. So what we're working on here is it's actually the lower bit of a pair of breeches, sort of a dickie that you may recognize if you watch the how to put a knee band video on. So we're working in some kersey from Cochin and Phillips, and it's been faced with some linen. There is no buckram in this because there's really no need with the kersey. However, on some things you would want a piece of buckram in the middle of the lining piece and the outer fabric. For this type of buttonhole, this sort of just average, we're reinforcing a slit that we've made for a button to pass through, and it serves really no purpose beyond that. They're almost always worked through the lining as well. That's not going to be true in a lot of the other buttonholes that we're going to demonstrate further on down the road. A lot of the ones that look really nice tend to only be worked through the top layer and then the reinforcing layer. So that's usually buckram. So what do we need to do this? Well, obviously, of course, we need everything I just described. We're going to need a buttonhole chisel, which is this thing right here. You could use a wood chisel, but the difference between a wood chisel and an appropriate buttonhole chisel is that the buttonhole chisel actually is slanted on both sides, as you can see, where a wood chisel is usually only slanted on the one side. Trying to cut a buttonhole open with a pair of snips is not going to give you a very clean result. The reason buttonhole chisels really don't exist anymore today is because of the keyhole buttonhole. So if you own anything today, you will likely notice that most of the buttonholes have sort of a round bit where the button sits and then the slit open. So that round bit is made with a punch, and then you can get a pair of snips in to snip it. But we don't do that in the 18th century. It's just a line that gets cut in. So we need a buttonhole chisel. So that's a tool that we absolutely need. Of course, we need something to make our buttonholes with. And today what we're going to be using is a size F silk twist. Now, a lot of times historically, sort of working class buttonholes are made with mohair twist. This doesn't really exist anymore today. And the stuff that does exist, there's like one place I think it still makes it. It's just difficult to work with because it's not meant for this purpose. So I go with a size F silk twist. You can get this from most beading stores today. So you can see this is a purely silk size F. I like the size F because it's rather thick. Now when I do higher quality stuff, I use a thinner one. But for today, we're going to use the size F. So this will be used for making both our gimp and actually doing the buttonhole stitch. And we'll talk about gimp here in a moment. We're also going to need some kind of linen thread. And this is going to be used once we open this up to close our buttonhole. So, you know, just your normal 50 by 3, 35 by 2, just your normal sewing linen will get the job done. I guess we're not going to be able to get the camera to focus here, are we? No, we're not. So, anyway, there we are. We'll need needles. We'll need 2 needles at least to do this. Well, 3, I guess, for the linen one also, if you really want to have everything sort of separate, but a minimum of 2. It's also a good idea to have a piece of like scrap silk or nice linen laying around, and we'll discuss what that's for in a moment. And that's really about it. There's not a whole lot that goes into this. Beeswax. Beeswax is going to be a really big one. We're going to use a lot of wax when preparing this thread. So the thread itself, let's talk about this for a moment. So this is 3 strands that have been twisted together. And we're going to see if we can get this to focus. There we go. So it's 3 strands that have been twisted together. And if we don't wax the absolute crap out of this. It will start to come apart on us while we're working with it, and it will have a tendency to knot up on itself quite a bit, which is a problem because we're going to be making a series of knots as we go along. So we don't want this to be fighting itself. The twist goes in a direction, obviously, because that's how twists work. So paying attention to the direction the twist goes. So you can see if you twist it the one way, it tightens up on itself. When you twist it the other way, it starts to loosen up. So for this stuff here, I've noticed that when I spool it off, where my hand is when I pull to spool it, that's the side that I want to go through the needle, and it works the best that way. So how do we prepare this thread to be used? We'll talk about that first, and then we'll talk about preparing the buttonhole itself. So when making a buttonhole, ideally you want enough thread to finish the task at hand. If you're doing a really long buttonhole, that might be just an awful lot of thread. So in that case, we need to at least be able to complete a run. You don't want to be running out of thread somewhere in the middle and trying to switch out. Being able to do that cleanly is sort of like an expert skill, and it's kind of nonsense. You just don't want to do it. The only time that you may see that done is usually in modern tailoring, and they'll switch the color of the buttonhole from one side to the other in the middle, just to look cool. So we'll spool basically an arm's length off for this. Our buttonhole here is 1.25 inches long, so that should be enough. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, like I said, wax the crap out of this, okay? So you just run the thread through the wax 4 or 5 times at least. Some of this may end up happening off camera, and I'm kind of sorry about that, but it's sort of our usual setup. The camera is between me and what we're working on. And that makes things a little awkward sometimes because this isn't really how people should work. But so we're going to get it good and waxed, okay? Really waxed, really sticky. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take one end and we're going to wrap it around our finger like this, okay? And we're going to do the same thing on the back side. And every time that we're working with the silk twist, this is what we're going to do. And then we're going to pull this taut, okay? And we're going to pluck it a little bit. So we pull it taut and give it a little pluck from both ends. Okay, and what that does is it helps set the twist in the thread and sort of even out the tension along the way, so that this is just a more harmonious thing to work with. And then we'll needle it up. Don't skip that step right there. I'm sorry, we're not going to needle it up yet. We're almost skipping a step. Okay, so after we've plucked it, this is where our piece of silk comes in. So what we're going to do here, and I'll demonstrate this on the camera, but I'm going to have to actually do it off camera because of the setup. But what we're going to do is we're going to wrap the silk around the thread, and we're going to pull it through like that. And you see that some of that wax came off? So the silk creates just enough friction where it'll help melt some of that wax, and it'll get rid of some of the just surface excess. This should be done with a decent amount of speed and force to just, to create enough friction to get this done, okay? And now we are ready to needle this thing up. Slide it through the needle in the usual way. And now our thread preparation has completed. So now we will move on to preparing the buttonhole itself. All right, preparing the buttonhole itself to be opened up. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to do a basting stitch around the outside of this. Now the reason for that is to hold all the layers together so they don't end up shifting around a whole bunch, okay? So I got a needle here with some basting thread on it. And this works quite simply by just taking a series of diagonal stitches to hold all the layers. Now we don't want to pucker anything when we do this. We just want to secure all the layers. Okay, so it looks like that. Let's zoom you guys in a little bit. There we go. So we're just holding all the layers together and doing this diagonal stitch all the way around. Okay, we don't want to go too close to the marked line because we don't want the basting stitch to get caught in the buttonhole stitch, but we do want it all secured. Okay, all right, so there we are. So now what we're going to do is we're going to open it with the buttonhole chisel. Now, like any other sort of knife type tool, it's a good idea to strop it before you use it so that we get a nice cut with it. And then it will prevent you from having to resharpen this thing all that often. So how do we cut this thing? Well, I just kind of use my clapper as the undercut, but you put the chisel down the middle and give it a push. And that's it. And what it does is it makes a nice, clean hole, right? You can see that on both sides. But now if we leave this alone as it is, it's going to start to come apart. So this is where we need the linen thread. So let me thread up a needle here. And I'll show you about that. So what we're going to do essentially, because we're working in wool in this demonstration, is we're just going to do a whip stitch around, and that will hold everything together and where we want it to be. Now, if we were doing this in, let's say, linen, cotton, silk, that kind of thing, there's some extra steps. And we will demo that in the next video. We will show you how that works. But essentially, you have to do a back stitch, and then if the thread itself or the fabric itself is really prone to fraying, we use something called fray stop. All right, so getting started, what we're going to do is we're going to take the needle and we're going to just sort of bury it into the thread here. We're not going through all the layers, and we're going to come out there. You can see we're not going through all the layers. We're just burying the thread. So we don't need to make a knot. We're just going to bury the thread into the fabric. We'll leave a little tail there, and we'll cut that off later. And then we're just going to go around, and we're going to do a whip stitch. And what we're trying to do is anchor that that lining thread or the lining fabric to the top fabric, just so everything stays the way we want it to be. We don't want to catch too much of either, because this isn't actually holding the buttonhole together at all, and we want the whip stitch to be hidden when we're done. This is just another means of keeping things from shifting around, really. It's not really going to do anything more than that. And when we get to the end, kind of the same thing. We're just going to bury it into the fabric and come out. And that's it. So now we're just going to pull some tension on it and snip it off right at the fabric line. And what you can see here, zoom you guys in. What you can see here is we've whip stitched all the way around, just to kind of anchor things together. And now we're ready to actually get to work on making a buttonhole stitch. So let's go ahead and set up for that step, and we'll get into it. Okay, here we go. Actually making the buttonhole itself now. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do what's called padding out the buttonhole, and we're going to do that with something that oftentimes gets called gimp. Now, however, in 18th century buttonholes, we don't really see gimp very often, really, if at all. Gimp refers to the type of thread that gets laid down on the outside of the buttonhole, and the buttonhole stitch gets done on top of it to make it look nicer, essentially. What we're going to be using today is just a double strand of the silk twist. Now we're going to do this in the usual manner. We're going to bury our needle inside of the fabric, and we're going to pull it through. Now we will go over making gimp in a later video just to show it to you. It really helps raise the buttonholes up and off. But we're going to go ahead and bury that through, okay? And we're going to lay this double strand down along the outside edge of the buttonhole. And I'm just going to anchor it by kind of holding it in place with the needle. We don't want it permanently attached yet because we want to have some control over this while we're working the buttonhole stitch on top of it. So it's just going to look like this here. If you can see, I'm sorry about the jump of the focus. It's kind of annoying, but you can see about how far back it is. Okay. Now the buttonhole stitch itself. So I guess I should mention real quick that this thread was prepared in the same way that the other thread was. So there's that. So the buttonhole stitch itself. So again, we'll bury the needle in, and we'll come out right at the edge here. Okay. And we'll get started. So there's two ways you can do a buttonhole stitch. They make the same stitch. It's just two different ways of accomplishing the same task. Let's zoom you guys in here, and we can make this a little bit more visible. So the first way, this is the way that I tend to like to do it while I'm working down the edge of the buttonhole, is you put the needle in and you come up, okay, kind of just past the gimp, and you take the tail end of the thread and you wrap it clockwise around the needle, and then we pull. And this is going to make a little knot. And when we seat the knot, we want to pay attention to two things. Well, three things, really. The angle at which we pull the knot in, how much force we do this with. We just want to seat the knot. We don't really want to, like, yank it down. And we want to hold the gimp so we don't end up pulling the gimp into the buttonhole. So it's going to look something like this. We're just going to pull that little purl and seat it. And that's it. And then we're going to move on to the next stitch. We're going to leave a little gap in between the stitching because this is not one of the super nice buttonholes, and we need room for the purls to sit against one another, not the thread itself necessarily. Pull, tail comes around clockwise. Anchor the gimp, pull it 45 degrees, and just seat the purl. And that's it. Now the other way we can do this is we can take the thread and we can wrap it clockwise around the buttonhole, and then we can push the needle through. I like to do this with a bar tack. I don't like to do this while making the buttonhole itself. The reason for that is I just find this ends up making more knots as we go along. Every now and then you may need to retension the gimp. And we're going to just continue this stitch all the way down along the edge. Okay. Now I'm using a white buttonhole thread, obviously, on this gray cloth. You should do everything I just did with a color matching thread. If you can't find a color that matches what you're working on perfectly, go a shade darker. That's kind of the general rule of thumb. And then you should have good results. Now, doing these buttonholes are a good way to start because the expectation is not perfection at the end, right? These are not perfect buttonholes. But we should be practicing these with the intent of creating perfection. So this type of buttonhole, historically, would have been the kind that's done, I would say, quickly. Kind of just lay the gimp down and get going. Right, there's no time wasted on these because there doesn't need to be. Now, that being said, they would have been done quickly by people who had the muscle memory to do them quickly. That is to say, they did these all the time. If you don't have that muscle memory, don't do them quickly. Because at the end of the day, what we're aiming for here is a result, not doing everything exactly the way that they did things. And that sort of philosophy, I would say, drives most of my work. We're looking for a result, not necessarily doing things the way that they did them. My job is not to interpret clothes making the way it was done. My job is to just make clothes for people, right? So the finished result is what I get paid for, not necessarily the process. So you can see what we have going on here, right? Guess we could reset the focus. So what do I mean by results and not process? Well, for example, when I measure somebody, I use measuring tape, right? I don't use a strip of paper and make notches in it. But of course, the measuring tape didn't exist yet. I use a modern iron. Oftentimes, it's a boiler iron and it creates steam. Of course, they didn't, right? They used an iron heated in a fire and used a wet cloth to create steam. Now, I do have dry irons and I use them when they are appropriate, but they still use electricity to make heat. So at the end of the day, right, the finished result should be what it should be. Now, if you are of the type of individual who needs to do things the way they did them for, one reason or another, because you're actually demonstrating to the public the way things were done, and then by all means, do them that way. But something like this, you could not do the way they did it unless you have the muscle memory to do it. It's kind of just that simple, isn't it? So take as much time as you need to make the results that need to be made. But just understand that this type of buttonhole will be the type of buttonhole that kind of just got done. You know, these are not necessarily to be looked at. They are just to secure the edge of the slit that we cut open so a button can pass through it. So there you can see the gimp and all the buttonhole stitches, and on the back side we've caught through the lining. No issues. So now we're at the end and we need to talk about a bar tack. So we're going to take the needle and we're going to bring it up just past and at the end of the buttonhole. No buttonhole stitch here. Just pull it in, okay? And we're going to have to guesstimate on the other side about how deep we need to go. And we're going to make 3 loops here, okay? And these 3 loops are going to secure the end of the buttonhole, so it doesn't want to rip open anymore, okay? Sorry, I'm sliding you out of camera view. 3 loops, pulled fairly tight, like so. So there we go, 3 loops, okay? Now, take your needle that you've been working with and set it aside. And take the needle that has the gimp on it here and put it underneath these 3 loops we made and just barely catch the fabric and catch it underneath that loop and pull it, okay? There we go. And then we're going to lay the gimp down the outside of the other end of the buttonhole. And just like before, we're going to anchor it. And just let it be there. All right, so forget about that for now. Go back to your original needle. So, dealing with the bar tack. So this is where I do like to do the loop thing, okay? So, looping counterclockwise. I think earlier I showed you the wrong thing. I think I showed you to loop clockwise. That is incorrect. See, here you go, muscle memory kicking in. I don't actually know what it is I do. I just do things. So forget my earlier instruction. You take the thread and you loop it counterclockwise around where you're going to work. And then the needle gets worked in the middle here. Now what we're doing, okay, this is very important. What we're doing is we're catching we're wrapping this around the threads of the bar tack, okay? We're not catching any of the fabric at all. We're just going around threads of the bar tack. And then we're going to pull this closed and seat that purl all the way to the outside, okay? Like that. And then again, make a counterclockwise loop. Catch just the threads in the bar tack. Seat the purl down next to it. And do this all the way across. Understand that what we're doing is just reinforcing the bar tack. That's it. The fabric plays no part in this at all. Okay? The fabric's reinforced by the loops of the bar tack. We are now just armoring the bar tack itself. We're doing nothing else. And that's it. There's a bar tack. Now, let's get ourselves set up to go down the other side, okay? So start by taking your needle and just looping back into the buttonhole. No buttonhole stitch, just loop back into it, okay? Like this. And that will hold that end of the bar tack down. And now we start working the buttonhole stitch all the way down the other side. Now this side oftentimes can be easier because you've already set your stitch lengths on the other side. So you can kind of just mimic that. Your needle will almost naturally just kind of get caught in the grooves. So this side usually goes quicker because you have to make less judgment calls on this side. Your needle will it'll just lock into the distancing you kind of already made on the other side, which is pretty cool. Sorry, I keep moving you guys out of camera. And I'm sure that's terribly annoying to watch. It's a little bit of a balancing act here doing this. It's going to take a little getting used to, you know, doing the looping, the pulling, paying attention to the angle you pull, but also using your left thumb or your right thumb if you're left-handed to hold that gimp in place. If you don't do that, if you don't hold this in place when you set that purl, what you're going to end up doing is rolling the gimp down into the side, inside of that buttonhole, and that is 100% not what we want to do. We want the gimp to sit up on top of the buttonhole. And what that's going to do is a couple things. It gives something for this thread to anchor against whenever we're making the stitch. It helps the stitch itself set up and up from the buttonhole and look nice. But it will also give the illusion of your, okay, see what I'm talking about with knotting things. Now we got this nightmare to deal with. It will give the illusion that your stitches are nicer looking than they probably really are. Because the gaps between them become less prominent. All these sort of things, which are inevitably not going to be the same. Now, on the white thread, in the white thread with the gray background, no matter what, you're gonna see that. Also, with this type of buttonhole, we're leaving more gap between than we would some of the nicer buttonholes. So when we get to the nicer buttonholes, you'll see that trick more prominently, really. It makes a bigger difference with the nicer buttonholes than it does with these. But if you attempted this without the gimp, I promise you, you would really notice the difference. Now, I did advise you, especially for this being the first buttonhole in the series of them, you know, practice these as if you're trying to attempt perfection, but understand that it is correct for these to not be perfect. When you see these types of buttonholes on originals, they are rarely ever perfect, which is not true of the nicer ones. Again, I'm pretty convinced that these are just made super quickly in workshops. They do nothing more than secure the hole that we cut in the fabric. And that's it. They're not here to look at all pretty. But use these types of buttonholes to develop some muscle memory. All right, when we get to the end, we do the same thing. We're going to make a bar tack. Right, so our needle is going to come through just to the outside of where we finish stitching. And we're going to do 3 loops. Set that needle aside. Grab the needle that has this gimp here and bring it over to the edge of the bar tack, bury it into the cloth and come out. And that's going to anchor it into its final position. Like so. Give it a little tug, cut it off the surface, you'll never know it was there. All right, last bar tack. So again, we're going to do the counterclockwise loop. Grab just the threads of the bar tack, seat the purl. Just the threads of the bar tack, seat the purl. And we're going to do that all the way across. Now, when I get ready to finish here, this may be a little difficult to see, but the last stitch that I take on a bar tack, on the edge where we started, I put the needle through not just the bar tack, but I grab the first one or maybe even two, depending on how tightly done they are, of the little legs of the buttonhole stitch at the beginning, just so it doesn't want to walk out, and it sort of completely locks them all together like that. And then we just take the needle, bury it into the fabric, and come out. Okay. Now we just got to cut all these little tails off. So pull some tension, cut it at the surface. Pull some tension, cut it at the surface. And pull some tension, cut it at the surface. So that is our buttonhole. Now, the last thing that I recommend you do with this buttonhole, there's really no pressing involved with this type of buttonhole. So the last thing that I recommend you do is just hold your steam iron above it and hit the steam button a few times, and that will melt the wax and it will lock it all into place. So I'm going to go do that real quick and then show you what it looks like. So there you are. I didn't touch the buttonhole at all with the iron. All I did was blast the hot steam on top of it so that the wax would melt into the fabric, or into the thread rather, I guess. And then we'll just lock it all in place. So that's it. That's the sort of basic working class buttonhole. Nothing special or fancy about it at all. Okay. You can see with that gimp running around the edge, there's a distinct sort of outline to this, right? And when you get it, you know, a little bit away, matter of fact, I think we can even zoom out here. The little unevenness of your stitching becomes sort of less prominent until you like really zoom in on the thing, right? And then you can see, yeah, it's not the most even job in the world, and it doesn't need to be. Okay, that's the key detail here. All right, is that it doesn't need to be because of the type of buttonhole this is. Now we'll deal with making things look prettier when we deal with the type of buttonhole where they need to be prettier. But this is a good place to start. This has all of the basic techniques in it that you need to make a good buttonhole and start practicing how all of this stuff fits together. So don't skip any of the steps that were described in here. And then in the next video, we'll discuss, we'll probably do the same buttonhole, but we will do it in what I call a fragile fabric. So we'll probably do them in linen. We use a different thread for doing them in linen, and there's quite a few different preparatory techniques that go into using something like linen. Now, the basic idea behind what we're going to do will apply to some things like silk. However, in silk, you would definitely use silk thread. But that'll be our next video, so stay tuned for that. And then where we go from there, I guess I'll make up my mind when we get there. But there's a whole world of buttonhole finishings here that we're going to go through in the next series of videos. So stay tuned, and I appreciate you being here for this one. I hope it's useful for you, and we'll see you in the next ones. Take care.